Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to answer the questions of the book habits tag, one I gather is fairly old, but which several people have been doing recently. I first saw this tag on Jennifer Brooks's channel, to which I will link below, and I most recently saw it over at Taking Tea with Catherine and Noah's channel, Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse. I've linked to their inspiring videos below. All right, the first question is, do you have a certain place at home for reading? I read anywhere. Often I read in bed or while I'm sitting on the couch. Sometimes I sit in my old denim nursing chair, a padded rocker with a footstool. Sometimes I sit at the dining room table or at my desk or on the floor. With spring coming now, I'm looking forward to reading outside, sitting in my plastic Adirondack chair while half looking at the redbuds just starting to bloom and listening to the birds. Next, question 2. Bookmark or random piece of paper? I mentioned in a previous tag that I pretty much use anything. I have amassed a zillion of those free bookmarks from the library and from booksellers and the like. Often I save theater tickets to use as markers, but I also use whatever flyer for lawn care or roof maintenance or home mortgages that just arrived in the mail, if it's at hand at the right moment. Although I cross-stitched a few bookmarks for friends way back in high school in the early 1980s, I've never used a handmade marker, mostly because I really like very thin ones that won't shift the binding in the way that a knitted bookmark might, for example. But I have to say I was intrigued by all of you who talked about making special fabric bookmarks. Given that I've just tried out sewing a face mask, a more or less successful undertaking, I might try making myself a cloth marker. Thanks for the inspiration, BookTube. The third question. Can you just stop reading, or do you have to stop after a chapter or a certain number of pages? Interestingly, this question is a little related to crafts too. When I first started knitting seriously, I felt like I could not put a project down until I had finished a row. The idea of just leaving off whenever I needed to stop for whatever reason seemed appalling. But then I started knitting in the round occasionally, where there's no end of a row, and the idea of stopping at the end of a round seemed kind of silly. And then I started knitting shawls, and often a row might be 200 or 300 stitches, and saying I needed to spend half an hour just to get to a stopping place seemed unacceptable, at least to the people around me who needed me at that moment. So I adjusted and now stop at some reasonable spot. For example, at the end of a 10-stitch repeat if it's a pattern with a repeating set of different stitches. I guess I take the same approach with reading. I remember telling my mother when I was young, in the midst of an exciting Nancy Drew mystery, that I couldn't come for lunch, quote, until a commercial, meaning the end of a chapter. But every chapter ended with a huge cliffhanger that made me want to get to the next chapter. The only solution was to read the whole book in one sitting, and I did that very thing for many years. I don't anymore. If I'm choosing when to stop, I'll usually finish a chapter, or at least a section. But if I need to stop for some reason, I can put the book down, even when I'm in the middle of a word. I do, however, have to put a bookmark in the right spot and not leave it at the back of the book or on the table before I close things up. For question number 4, do you eat or drink while reading? Interesting question. I frequently make myself a cup of tea or perhaps a glass of wine before I sit down to read. If I were planning a date with my book, I would not be preparing snacks. On the other hand, if I am eating dinner alone, I'm likely to be accompanying my mealtime with a book. So, if the main purpose is to read, I won't be eating. If the main purpose is to eat, I might be reading. Question 5 is about multitasking. Music or TV while reading? No. I like things quiet. I'm an introvert who spent my early years as an only child, and I suspect that might have shaped my desire to read without any noise. I vastly prefer true silence, and I tend to seek out whatever spot will give me the most peace. Back in college, that sometimes meant turning on unobtrusive music to block out voices in the hallway or whatever. And now I live in a family all spending our days together during this pandemic, and everybody needs to make some noise. My son is a musician and is often either playing an instrument or playing a recording. Our house is old and creaky, and people do have to walk around and climb the stairs. Once I'm involved in a book, it's really easy to be absolutely unaware of these noises. But as I've gotten older, I find that it takes me a lot longer to enter that state of flow. Luckily, in this case at least, I'm deaf in one ear. When I get really desperate for a little silence, I put my hearing ear down on a pillow and all is well. The sixth question asks whether we read one book at a time or several at once. I often read several at once, but typically I only have one fiction, one nonfiction, perhaps an extra book that's a collection of essays or short stories, and also probably an audiobook. And although we haven't been doing it lately, I also sometimes have a book going with my husband, which we read aloud to each other. So I guess my answer is several, although I'm a lot more monogamous than I think most booktubers are. Question 7 asked, reading at home or everywhere? Everywhere, or at least it was everywhere before the pandemic. As a kid, I even learned to read while riding my bike around our very quiet neighborhood. I don't think I would do that anymore, although I guess I might be listening to an audiobook then. And honestly, I really love reading in a cafe, despite all the background noise. I guess that noise feels unspecific, and not noises that I feel I should be paying attention to, and it usually feels easy to relax into that kind of situation. Next is question 8, reading aloud or silently in your head. For me, there are 3 options here. One is reading aloud literally, something I have loved doing and loved listening to for my whole life. I mentioned a minute ago that my spouse and I often read aloud to each other, and certainly we also read to our child when he was young, and we still do occasionally, even though he'll turn 21 at the end of the month. Then there's the question of reading to myself. Depending on what I'm reading, I'm sometimes reading subvocally, that is, saying the words aloud in my head, hearing the sounds, even though my lips aren't moving and my neighbors can't hear my thoughts. I never did that kind of reading in high school. I always just flew through the words on the page, going through them much more quickly than I do when I say them to myself. As you might guess, I am a slow talker even when I'm talking to myself, so subvocalizing really slows me down. But when I started studying poetry in college, I started subvocalizing a lot. And now I very often speak the words to myself, even though it slows me down so much, just to appreciate the sounds and rhythms that authors use in poetry, but also in fiction, and often in nonfiction too. So I guess my answer to the question, reading aloud or silently, is yes. Number 9. Do you read ahead or even skip pages? Not typically. I do read introductions that give away plot lines, and I fairly frequently will glance through the endnotes for a classic novel or for a work of history before I read a specific chapter, which often gives some hints about what's about to happen. And I do sometimes read the conclusion of a work of academic history after the introduction, but before I read the body of the work. I am not a person who minds, quote, spoilers, even in the vast majority of fiction. I absolutely love rereading books, even mysteries, for example, and in no way mind knowing what's about to happen in the plot. For me, that knowledge doesn't spoil a book at all. I care far more about figuring out how an author makes things work than I do about knowing what's going to happen in a plot. I realize this is a pretty unusual attitude, and I keep thinking I'll make a longer video on it at some point, but the point's kind of relevant here. Question number 10. Do you break the spine or keep a book in like-new condition? I never break a spine on purpose, although I do remember being taught in school how to break the spines of new textbooks in an orderly and even way. Weird. If I am sneaking a read of a book I intend to give as a gift, yes, I have done that, then I am very careful not to open the pages fully. If I'm reading a book I own, I don't break spines on purpose, but I don't make a huge effort to keep it looking new. See the next question for more on that. And a lot of the books I buy are used, with spines that are no longer pristine. It can actually be reassuring sometimes not to have to worry. And I've been known to break a spine deliberately, actually. I have a couple of older Oxford World Classics that are long and stiff, almost impossible to open enough to read the inner parts of lines of text. And those I have carefully broken in the formal style I learned in school with textbooks. And the final question. Do you write in your books? Indeed I do. I write fairly lightly in pencil, and I try to restrict myself a bit, although I'm not always successful. Part of reading a book is having an intense dialogue with it. I mark sections I think are beautiful, and ones that make me think. I mark sections that echo other parts of the book, or that echo other books. I write comments when I think I see how the author is trying to do something, or when I disagree. In fact, I find it hard to read without a pencil in my hand, a trait I acquired from my mother, I think. I use my library a lot, and I've even made careful marks in a library book, combined with jotting the page number down on whatever bookmark I'm using, then gone back to the mark after I've read the book, taking notes elsewhere if I feel I need to, and erasing the pencil mark in the margin. So that's it for this tag. I encourage all of you to give it a go. The questions feel just right for a time when our brains might not be up to the task of thinking deeply about bigger issues, but it still brings up personal ideas about who we are as readers, something I'd love to see from all of you. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.